Welcome to episode 6 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you line by line through the 6 books of the poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start with today's episode, let me remind you of our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, not to put our own positions into Lucretius's or Epicurus's words. Second, in this podcast we won't be talking about modern political issues. Over at the EpicureanFriends.com web forum, we call this approach not Neo-Epicurean, but Epicurean. Epicurean philosophy is not a religion. It's not Stoicism, humanism, libertarianism, atheism, or Marxism. It's a unique philosophy of its own, to be understood on its own terms, not in terms of conventional modern morality. Third, Lucretius will show that Epicurus was not focused on over-the-top luxury, like some people say, but neither did Epicurus teach a minimalist lifestyle, as other people say. Epicurus taught that feeling, pleasure, and pain are the guides that nature gave us to live by, not gods, idealism, or virtue ethics. More than anything else, Epicurus taught that the universe is not supernatural in any way, and that means there's no life after death, and any happiness we'll ever have comes in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. Remember that our homepage is LucretiusToday.com, and there you can find a free copy of the version of the poem from which we're reading, and links to where you can discuss the poem with us between episodes at EpicureanFriends.com. In the episodes so far, here are the main topics we've covered. That pleasure, using the allegory of Venus, is the driving force of all life. That the way to rid ourselves of pain is to replace pain with pleasure, using the allegory of Venus entertaining Mars, the god of war. That Epicurus was the great philosophic leader who stood up to supernatural religion, opened the gates to a proper understanding of nature, and thereby showed us how we too can emulate the life of gods. That it is not Epicurean philosophy, but supernatural religion, which is truly unholy and prompts men to commit evil deeds. That false priests and philosophers will try to scare you away from Epicurean philosophy with threats of punishment after death, which is why you must understand that those threats cannot be true. That the key to freeing yourself from false religion and false philosophy is found in the study of nature. And that the first observation which underlies all the rest of Epicurean philosophy is that we observe that nothing ever comes from nothing. Now that we're up to date, let's start today's discussion, which begins at approximately line 137 of the poem. Elaine, you want to read?
From the Daniel Brown?
Yeah, read it from Daniel Brown.
Since we've been doing that. Okay. I know it is hard to explain in Latin verse the dark and mystic notions of the Greeks, for I have things to say that require new words, because the tongue is poor, the subject new. But your virtue and the pleasures I expect from tender friendship make me bear the toil and spend the silent night with wakeful eyes, studious of words and numbers I shall use, to open your mind such scenes of light which show the hidden qualities of things unknown. These terrors of the mind, this darkness then, not the sun's beams, nor the bright rays of day, can ever dispel, but nature's light and reason, whose first of principles shall be my guide. Nothing was by the gods, of nothing made. For hence it is that fear disturbs the mind, that strange events in earth and heaven are seen, whose causes cannot appear by reason's eye. And then we say they were from powers divine. But when we rest convinced that nothing can arise from nothing, then the way is clear to our pursuit. We distinctly see whence everything comes into being, and how things are formed without the help and trouble of the gods. If things proceed from nothing, everything might spring from anything and want no seed. Men from the sea might first arise, and fish and birds break from the earth, and herds and tender flocks drop from the sky, and every kind of beast fixed to no certain place might find a being in deserts or in cultivated fields. Nor the same fruit on the same trees would grow, but would be changed. And all things bear. For had not everything its genial seed, how is it that everything derives its birth from causes still the same? But now, since things are formed from certain seeds and first rise into light, where every being has its principles and matter fitly framed, from hence we see that all things cannot spring from everything, since each has certain secret properties peculiar to itself.
I've read this section before. It's hard to, I guess, come up with an analysis of it.
Yes.
Well, I think that the first thing to address is pretty clear. Is relevant to today's issues with reading Epicurus and the other Epicureans, which is translations from one language into another, and from an older version of one language into the modern version are difficult. And so Lucretius is telling us right up front that his Latin is not adequate to the information in the Greek.
That's a point that apparently Cicero didn't care for, that he would try to defend the Latin language as being equally communicative as the Greek language. But yes, and to expand that context, Elaine, Lucretius had access to all the texts, all the professors, a whole series of people around him who could explain things and discuss things with him. And even in that context, he found it difficult to translate precisely what Epicurus had said into the Latin language. So we have so many fewer resources than he did, and so many extra years and so many extra layers of commentators and copyists to go through, that we're relying on them almost as much as we're relying on the original writer to know what was actually said.
Yeah, I think that's important to keep in mind constantly when we're making modern interpretations, that if a specific translation doesn't fit with the whole thing, that ought to ring alarm bells.
Yes, it should. And yes, it should. And listen, also, the last part of that sentence that we're talking about, the tongue is for, okay, we understand that going from language to language can create problems. But then it says the subject knew. Yes. And that's what I would emphasize right now, too, because when you don't even know what the people are talking about, when your context of virtue and your context of religion and your context of right and wrong, people today have been indoctrinated, educated, peer pressured into believing a whole set of ideas about the way the world works. And Epicurean philosophy is so different from that. There is no absolute virtue, absolute divine revelation from God. And so the perspective is so different that people who have not been made familiar with that perspective are going to immediately try to put things in their own categories. They're going to look at their own existing boxes, and they're going to say, well, Epicurus must have been saying this because everybody else today says that, so it can't possibly be that he could be saying something different. And that's a huge problem, I think.
Especially when it comes to when people refer to their own little boxes and then superimpose those projections onto the philosophy. I would say that a good example in regards to Epicurus is, he believed in a different kind of pleasure. He believed in a mental pleasure.
Yes.
Because they can't conceive of any sort of hedonist philosophy.
Yes.
Or anything else. So they build this justification.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, you can carry that over to examples that maybe have more merit to them in terms of talking about gods. Epicurus uses the word gods in a way that is fundamentally different than we use today. My gosh, that's one of the most regular problems that we have. People will read Epicurus for the first time. They'll see he's talking about gods. They'll say, well, I thought Epicurus was an atheist, and they'll walk away, or they'll just decide to put it aside, and because it doesn't conform with their understanding, they think that, well, Epicurus taught that the universe is based on atoms and was natural, so why is he talking about gods? And they get confused or just think that it's not worth pursuing any further because they don't understand the Epicurean context. Right. And another example that we see all the time, we'll probably see as long as we discuss these things, is the issue of virtue, because the world has been conditioned by the Platonists and the Stoic and the Aristotelians to believe that virtue has an absolute meaning to it, and that it's possible to identify virtue for the sake of virtue, and that virtue is always going to be the same. But that doesn't appear to have been Epicurus' perspective at all. And so when Epicurus talks about virtue, you have to remember the contextual nature of virtue as a tool for pleasure that Epicurus makes very, very clear in the text that we still have, but that people don't expect and they don't recognize, and therefore they insist, and naturally so. I'm not saying that they're malicious in doing so, but it's just natural for them, who have been conditioned all their lives to think that virtue has been handed down by God, to analyze it in that way. And so they have to understand that Epicurus did not analyze it in that way.
Right.
In fact, that's in the next sentence of that paragraph. But your virtue and the pleasures I expect from tender friendship make me bear the toil. This is another example. Lucretius is saying it's going to be toilsome to write the poem, but the pleasures that he's going to get from it make it worthwhile. The pleasure that he's going to get from the friendship, again, not friendship for the sake of friendship, but the pleasures that come from the friendship are what is going to motivate him to spend the night working through the poem. I noticed they use the word numbers here. Sometimes these translators will use the word lays, L-A-Y-S, and I understand what they're talking about there. It's just the lines of the poem. That's
right.
Just an archaic way of talking about the lines of the poem itself. If we move to the next sentence, which I think is also tremendously important, and the one that gets repeated several times in the poem because of its importance, is that these terrors of the mind are not dispelled by the sun's beams, but by study of nature. There's a lot going on there, that it's not necessarily the lights of day that can dispel anything, but an understanding has to take place. Not because you observe the sun that you can understand what's going on with the sun. You have to study what's going on.
Yes.
And again, this is an example to me of the structure of these lines. He repeats the same thing. The terrors of the mind, this darkness then, are both two statements of the same thing. And then not the sun's beams nor the bright rays of day. Those appear to me to be two statements of the same thing.
Right.
So it's like the method involved is pointing to multiple examples as a way of being clear.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a poetic device. So
I was going to say that
makes sense for him.
Definitely
to do that.
fits meter.
Yeah. And emphasis. When you repeat something, you're making sure that your readers know that you really mean it. That's why we have to keep repeating about pleasure over and over again. So it
kind of fits that ancient Greek method of storytelling, dactylic hexameter.
So he's contrasting. I mean, the sun's beams and the bright rays of day, that's certainly natural. So the way I see this is he's kind of contrasting just passively being alive. Like, the sun is not going to do this to you. The sun is not going to fix your terror. The nature's light and reason, that's in your process of observing, not just passively being done to. Do you think that fit?
I do. You're right. It's not a passive process of simply observing. That's not enough on its own. It's critical, it's important, and it's the place to start, but it is not the full description of the process.
I don't think of observing as passive. So I'm actually contrasting nature as the sun. Like, the sun is not going to reach down into your brain and get rid of your terror. But your observations, which is nature's, I think how he's using nature's like that. So observations aren't passive at all. That's you have to be aware of what you're observing. So it's the passive versus the active that I see being contrasted.
Yes, the answers that would remove the fears are still found within nature, but the means to find them are through reason, observation.
Which are active processes is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
That's a better way of looking at it than I said.
Because the way that, using the sun and the bright rays of day, it is very passive. The sun comes out every day. It's automatic. And you're not going to extrapolate anything new by just accepting that as is.
Yeah, or by sunbathing. Sunbathing is not going to fix your problem. But it might be nice.
Or sitting in an armchair.
It's not going to clear up your terror just to do that.
This is probably a place where we ought to look at the different translations on that particular passage, because done in several different ways. Bailey in that passage says, not by the rays of the sun or the gleaming shafts of day, but by the outer view and the inner law of nature. Now, I'm not sure about that. And then Monroe says, not by the rays of the sun and the glittering shafts of day, but by the aspect and the law of nature. Now, do you have Martin Ferguson Smith, Elaine?
I do. Let's see. Okay. This terrifying darkness that enshrouds the mind must be dispelled not by the sun's rays and the dazzling darts of day. Oh, I like that. Nice alliteration. But by study of the superficial aspect and underlying principle of nature. So I like this. To me, I saw that word reason. Thought, well, how odd, because reason is not part of the canon, and I'm kind of surprised at Epicurus for throwing that in there. Why did he do that? Well, I don't think he did.
Lucretius, you mean?
Yeah, I don't think Lucretius said that, because none of the other translations are using the word reason. It's all about different levels of observation. We know reason is a critical skill, but it is not primary information.
What line are we on?
It's after the section that's 30.
About 147 or so, depending on which translation you have, Charles.
All right. I have the Stallings edition with me.
It certainly sounds to me like the word study in Martin Ferguson Smith's version is a good word to use.
And that's more of an observing, not an abstract reasoning, but a direct observation kind of process.
The Stallings translation is a bit more closer to what we were saying. This dread, these shadows of the mind, must thus be swept away, not by rays of the sun nor by the brilliant beams of day, but by observing nature and her laws. And this will lay the warp out for us her first principle, that nothing's brought forth by any supernatural power out of naught.
Before we get to the last part, let's see if there's anything else we want to say about nature's light and reason, or the way Martin Ferguson Smith says that the superficial aspect and the underlying principle of nature. Now, is that an example of using two things that are meant to be the same thing, or are those different?
No, I mean, that would be like observing macro behaviors, like what happens when you throw a baseball versus the atoms. So it's all part of the same phenomena, but there are different, you can actually look at what you can divide the baseball into. If you don't really understand the inner workings of these processes, you may misunderstand what you're looking at from the macro level.
Especially since when we're discussing atomism, we're never going to be able to see or touch the atoms. We're going to be able to observe certain things, but then we're going to have to deduce other things from what we see.
Yes.
Should we move on to the next paragraph?
Maybe not the next paragraph, because the last part of that sentence there, depending on what translation, it might be the next paragraph, because I see that Martin Ferguson Smith does have it in the next paragraph. But the last part of the sentence, as stated in the 1743 edition, might be one of the most important ones in the whole poem, because Lucretius is saying, and echoing Epicurus from the letter to Herodotus, that the fundamental principle that shall be our guide is nothing was by the gods of nothing made. And that is ultimately the principle of observation that everything else is based on. Because if we were observing the gods making things from nothing. We would have a totally separate set of facts to go on, and we'd have to structure our philosophy differently. But we do not see the gods making anything from nothing. Now, a lot of times also the phrase is just nothing comes from nothing. It doesn't.
Right.
There's the addition of the by the gods in here is something we probably ought to comment on as well.
I think Lucretius added that.
I don't remember if that's in Herodotus or not, yes, but it sort of fits with the emphasis on what we're doing is we're getting to the bottom of whether there's truth to supernatural religion or not. And so by putting the by the gods in there, that emphasizes that supernatural religion is the issue.
It's not in
Martin
the Bailey
Ferguson
translation.
Smith says, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The word gods isn't mentioned in the Bailey translation of Letter to Herodotus, and that phrase Lucretius said, what it's echoing, at least in this translation, says, first of all, that nothing is created out of that which does not exist, and then it goes.
That's
on.
Herodotus.
Yep.
That's Herodotus or Lucretius, Charles?
That's Herodotus, Cyril Bailey.
What were you going to say, Elaine?
I believe this is here in the Latin version. It uses the word divinitas, divinitus. So Martin Ferguson Smith says nothing ever springs miraculously out of nothing. Yeah,
it seems pretty clear. And as we continue on to the next paragraph, it's clear that Lucretius is emphasizing the fact that that the gods are not making anything from nothing.
In the Latin, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but in the Latin meaning of divinitus is miraculously, or from God, or through divine power, or by divine aid, in a superhuman manner. So
does it?
I guess.
Elaine, in the Latin edition, is divinitus listed twice? Maybe another sentence down. I don't have it up with me.
I wouldn't be surprised because as we go forward, there he makes the same point basically again.
Mm-hmm.
Divino.
Okay. So this passage we're talking about now is the principle. There's several sentences involved in it. Then we'll go on to another passage or paragraph that's also in what we read today about sort of how we establish that fact by looking at things. But for the time being, we're still in the middle of him making the point that nothing comes from nothing at the will of the gods.
So, yeah, I may want to make this point again. No, I'm going to save this for the last paragraph, because there's a little interesting contrast in this last paragraph between today's religious outlook and at that time. Just remind me.
Okay. Martin, anything from you?
No, I listened to the conversation and it looks agreeable.
Good. Okay. And then he says that for hence it is that fear disturbs the mind, that strange events in earth and heaven are seen, whose causes cannot appear by reason's eye. And then we say they were from powers divine. But when we rest convinced, we need to be able to rest convinced that nothing can arise from nothing. Now there, it does not limit it to the gods, if that is a correct translation.
Yes.
And it would be probably wrong to limit Lucretius to saying that, things do come from nothing, but not by the gods. He's not saying that at all. He's following Epicurus's lead that nothing comes from nothing, but he's emphasizing in this context that the gods aren't doing it, and that's why we challenge religion as the motivating force and organizing principle of the universe.
Yeah.
And he says we distinctly see whence everything comes into being and how things are formed without the help and the trouble of the gods. Maybe that's another example of the contextual differences from today and then, because today we are just so used to omnipotent, and the gods have no trouble, or God has no trouble just controlling everything in the universe instantaneously without any trouble on his own part at all. But that was not the way the ancient Greeks looked at things. They had a much more common sense view that if somebody was going to be managing every minute thing in the universe, it was not going to be a particularly pleasant thing to do or easy to do, that it would be troublesome to try to do that even to a god.
There is also the view that the Greek gods, which were then incorporated by the Romans into their pantheon, was that the Greek gods were cruel. So maybe that's another piece of context we could include. It's a very different view
they certainly could.
Compared to today. We can look at the story of Midas, of Tantalus, Prometheus, the Greeks definitely were fearsome of their deities.
They could be cruel or arbitrary, or they'd fall in love with each other in unfortunate ways and times, and all sorts of things that we associate with humans as opposed
yes,
to
I was going to say very human characteristics.
I think this section emphasizes again the importance of understanding the underlying workings. He says, whose causes cannot appear by reason's eye, because if you're just looking at a meteor or something like you don't understand what's happening. Mm-hmm. And so then it's easy to use what I see where he says, and then we say they were from powers divine. That's the God of the gaps, the modern terminology for doing that. But if you actually understand the underlying physics, you won't be tempted to stick a God in there.
And that understanding that nothing can arise from nothing is what clears the way to our pursuit.
Yes.
And distinctly seeing how things are formed without involvement of the gods.
Right.
Well, the next paragraph is going to turn to the process of understanding that point and our argument in support of it. Is there anything else we want to say about the point itself before we move forward? Maybe I should say this to introduce the next paragraph, that it's the major contention of so many people. Epicurus is an empiricist. He says that everything comes directly from sensation, and he does not rely at all on deductive logic or reason of any kind. He's all sensations are true, and that's where it stops. And this next passage would be something that Norman DeWitt and others would point to as an example of how obviously that is not true, because he immediately begins his proof by means of if-then analysis of what we don't see, and deducing from what we do not see a conclusion that is important to explain what it is we do see.
But it's different from it's still different from the people who believe in pure reason, because it's always grounded in observation. It never leaves.
It's grounded. It's grounded in reality, but
always at every point.
It's starting with a speculation. It's starting with an observation.
Yes, it's a really critical difference. It's amazing how many modern intellectuals don't understand that the difference between what your premises are and what you do with them if you're doing abstract reasoning versus really keeping it real with Epicurus.
And even then, it does start out with if, but immediately after, towards the end of this, of that first line, he uses the word might. Mm-hmm. He's postulating based on observations, and I don't know the exact lines, but I know much later in the book when he talks about meteorology, and this is the same issue too. Same thing about empiricism here and speculating based on reality.
So when I read this, I started thinking about if you gave this passage to a modern Christian, because they're imagining only one supreme being, and their version has come away from the capricious idea to the point they disavow all the stuff in the Old Testament, as the humans just didn't understand what was going on. So what they would say is that God has set it up to mostly be that way, but every so often, because God can break any of those laws, God will make it little exceptions, the miracles. So it's mostly going to work like that, but not always.
We should probably read it.
So they wouldn't be, I think this wouldn't work today the same as it would have if you thought you were in this universe with these multiple capricious arguing gods who could just go around producing stuff magically everywhere, instead of one that they imagine has this well worked out plan that's not going to be freaking us out by making a plum grow on an apple tree, but is just going to selectively do these little miracles or big miracles or whatever. So interesting. The context of who you're talking to is going to affect what you focus on in your arguments.
people you're talking about, Elaine, have just totally dropped the connection but limiting reality to reason, because they say that God is omnipotent. He can do whatever he wants to, and it never bothers contradictions, observations that the world doesn't work a certain way. None of that bothers them, because whatever happens, they reconcile it back to being God's will, and he can do whatever he wants to. So there's just no connection whatsoever. It probably would make more impression on somebody who has already realized the fallacy and the problems with that kind of reasoning, and really wants to say, okay, well, I don't accept that omnipotent, ridiculous view of God doing anything he wants to, anytime he wants to, because I don't see that. But what do I do in place of that? Does that mean that everything is just totally random? And that's where this is going, I think, is it's reminding us that, of course, things are not totally random in the sense of chaotic from moment to moment. There is a method and a pattern that the seasons have, and in so many things that we observe, there is a cause and effect relationship. So where does that come from? And how could that be going on without the gods making it so? And this passage and the rest of the book, the rest of the poem largely, are an explanation of how the universe works in a regular manner without the gods being there to shepherd it. Charles, you were making the point we might want to read that again.
No,
Martin,
are you able? We should probably read the paragraph.
Yes. I think we read it all initially, but haven't repeated it.
Yes.
Somebody want to?
Sure, I'll read
Charles,
it.
Does that sound like you're going to do it?
Yeah. If things proceed from nothing, everything might spring from anything and want no seed. Men from the sea might first arise, and fish and birds break from the earth, and herds and tender flocks drop from the sky, and every kind of beast, fixed to no certain place, might find a being in deserts or in cultivated fields. Nor the same fruit on the same trees would grow, but would be changed, and all things bear. For had not everything its genial seed, how is it that everything derives its birth from causes still the same? But now, since things are formed from certain seeds, and first rise into light, or every being has its principles in matter fitly framed, from hence we see that all things cannot spring from everything, since each has certain secret properties peculiar to itself. I just want to say real quick, I think that's the line that inspired Botticelli to paint The Birth of Venus.
The one that has her standing on the seashell?
The seashell from the ocean with all the flowers and, yeah.
Really?
I think so.
So have you seen that before, or is it something that you thought of?
That's something, it's probably out there somewhere, but that's just that's what I
love
think.
that. I love that painting. Wow, interesting idea.
Because Botticelli was heavily inspired by Lucretius.
Oh my goodness, how interesting.
Well, what I'm seeing basically being discussed here is that the first part of this passage is saying that if, in fact, things came from nothing, then we would see all sorts of essentially chaotic phenomena with fish and birds coming up from the ground and birds just dropping out of the sky from nothing, and that all sorts of animals would live in all sorts of places where they're not suited to live.
Yeah.
Apple trees would grow pears and pear trees would grow apples and all those things. And
Dogs
then he moves
and cats
to the observation.
with each other.
That's exactly right. Which we know does not happen in the norm.
Yeah.
But we know that there is a norm, and that pear trees do give off pears, and that there's a pattern to things. And so we have to understand where that pattern comes from, and that's going to lead us into the discussion of the atoms.
But the image of people sprouting from the ocean, that's something that I think has it took off in the Renaissance, and like I said with Botticelli, and it given what Metri said as well, it really stuck with people even in the Enlightenment. So I think that this paragraph
now, Charles,
gets...
Yeah, it's certainly bringing up the topic. But, Charles, the paragraph is really saying those things don't happen.
Right,
so whether Metri is speculating that they could happen might be very different from what Lucretius is saying, that they don't happen.
And it could even
don't
be
just rise from the sea.
I know,
right?
Because I mentioned earlier that Lucretius uses the word might,
Right.
If
Right.
things,
Right.
But he's using it to say, to show that they don't. But occasionally you get a mutant. So unless you understand the underlying principles, you might say, well, see, that one came from nothing. um,
and
every time I hear this nothing comes from nothing line, I don't know if I'm the only one whose mind does this. I might be. I grew up, my parents were big musical fans, so I grew up with all those they had all the record albums of the popular Broadway musicals. And every time I hear that, it has a tune from the line in The Sound of Music, nothing comes from nothing. Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. But somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good. So that is another direction people can take off with this nothing comes from nothing. Even if they start there, they can still go in weird directions, like karmic kind of things. So,
but what I wanted to say though is that I understand Lucretius's point in saying this, to understand like what he's implying in regards to the phrase "nothing comes from nothing," but it's something that I've noticed, kind of like the imagery that it kind of brings up has stuck around, and the sources just point back to Lucretius. And
I think that's a good observation,
and
Charlie.
I think something may have been lost in translation, or maybe every author of the Enlightenment took it a different way than modern translations. Maybe. This is a 1743 edition, which is prior to the author of the Telemed and prior to Metri. So,
Charles, what you've just said brings up another point in my mind, which is that somebody listening or reading this for the first time might naturally or might ask themselves, well, what about evolution? Now, and where I'm going to go with that is I think that Lucretius is really focused on what we can observe for ourselves by just looking at the world ourselves. And we see that pears don't come from apple trees, birds just don't poof out of the sky, men just don't walk out of the ocean. And from those observations, we can see that there are no supernatural gods who are just displaying miracles to us every moment of our lives so that we need to be living in awe and fear of the gods. I think you can, that's probably the first and obvious point that he's making. Now, as far as whether, somebody, it's pretty common people pick up Lucretius because they want to study the history of science and the history of atomism and the history of scientific speculation about the formation of life and so forth. And so you can go off into the direction as well of saying, well, of what you were kind of going for, Charles, which is that, well, maybe there's a echo of evolution, Darwinian type of evolutionary theory here. And there's other parts of the poem that definitely go even further in that direction that you could use to discuss those subjects. But, I guess what I'm thinking is important to emphasize right here is that it's very easy to go off into much detailed analysis, or whether you want to call that a rabbit hole or not. You can say it's very easy to go off on those kind of discussions and miss probably what's the important point, which I think to me is that if there were supernatural gods controlling the world, we would see all these miraculous events going on all the time, we don't see them. We don't see them.
And Martin Ferguson Smith's translation I love. I mean, he just emphasizes that craziness of the idea. People could pop out of the sea. He says, born willy-nilly. That's the way I think the tone of, I think his tone fits the, sorry, that's not Martin Ferguson Smith. That's actually Stallings. But I like that. That's the spirit of this passage. It's just like, no, people are not popping out of the sea. And the key thing is the beginning. Everything might spring from anything. There's nothing about mutations or evolutions that would lead us to say everything might spring from anything. And that's what he's talking about here. That doesn't happen.
Probably another way to say the same point would be that in order for us to not be plagued with fear and doubt. We have to be confident in a method of thinking that inoculates us against that. And he's saying, I think from a very practical point of view, that we don't go with just fear or speculation. We trust our senses. We trust the things that we see around us. And if we don't see supernatural gods creating miracles every moment, then that's going to be the basis for having confidence that we haven't seen them at any other point in our lives. That gives us some degree of confidence that we're not going to see that happen either in the future. And even though we haven't been around for eternity, we haven't been around for 10,000 years, and we haven't seen it ourselves, so where would you get the idea that your great-great-grandfather could have seen it? You have to deal, okay, where I'm going with that too, you have to deal with the issue of you haven't been around, you don't know everything in the universe, you've not observed the entire history of humans. You have to decide what level of evidence you're going to take. Go ahead, Elaine.
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with you, and I'm also saying I got to run. I got to go to work. So,
all right.
Catch up with y'all next week.
All right.
Thank you, Elaine. We'll wrap up.
Yeah. I want to add one last thing to that paragraph, though. It's going to be really, really quick. I don't know if
sure. No, yeah, we want to get Martin in here too, so we got time. So go ahead, Charles.
So the language Lucretius uses, and just the examples, it's very clear that he is telling the audience these things are absurd, and we know they're absurd because we don't observe that ever happening. We don't see birds hatching in the air. We don't see people come out of the sea. So he's using that to kind of illustrate his point based off of things we already know that don't happen.
Yes, Charles. But and where I take that is back in the same direction. The premise of his argument is that we can take our own observations and reach a conclusion based on them. Because somebody could come up to you or to Lucretius and say, well, you haven't seen those things, Lucretius, but my Bible says that they happened all the time just 2,000 years ago. And so how do you deal with that?
Yeah. It's the same issue that Herodotus or his detractors used against him.
Martin, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with somebody who comes up to you and says, well, you, Martin, may not have seen fish fall out of the sky and men walk out of the ocean as adults, but that used to happen all the time. Take your time, Martin. I'll cut out the silence while you compose the ultimate answer to that question.
There are basically two different approaches here. One would be to tell, I don't believe in those fairy tales up front, or just leave it, okay, you have your viewpoint, I come from a different direction and disagree with that.
Those are clearly the diplomatic ways of dealing with things. I guess where I'm going further beyond that is that for our own sanity and our own confidence, we have to, in our own minds, have an explanation for why we don't believe, why we consider those to be fantasies, and why we have a different experience. And where I guess I'm going with it, it comes back down to the position of having confidence in your senses and having confidence in the logical position that your observations are as valid as anybody else's, and that there's no reason why your observations should be different from theirs. And that there's a burden of proof when somebody asserts, you got all these logical arguments to be made, I guess, but the burden of proof on somebody who's asserting something that is not readily observable should be high. You should have confidence that if somebody's asserting something to you that just simply makes no sense and is inconsistent with your own observation, they better have a strong chain of evidence to support what they're saying more than just hearsay, as a legal scholar might say. That's why hearsay is generally looked down upon in courts of law as being inadmissible unless there's some exception to the hearsay rules, people can assert anything. And at some point, you have to have a rule of confidence in your thought process, a rule of evidence about what you're going to allow and what you're not. Charles, you were going to say something, I think.
Yeah. I have a friend of mine. I'm not going to say his name, but he believes in fallen angels and all these crazy religious things. And his point for modern day science is exactly what you were saying. Oh, this happened 2,000 years ago. My book says this, you just haven't seen it. And yeah, it really establishes a point that we often have to come up with our own conclusions based on these principles.
It has to be commonly a problem and an issue in virtually every science, but it certainly is a common issue in the field of law and in legal analysis, because so much of it is built on the question of what evidence is going to be accepted and what evidence is not going to be accepted. And then there's going to be a wide variation in the evidence that is accepted as to how much emphasis and confidence you put into it. But there's also rules of evidence that just flatly prevent from coming into court certain types of assertions that have no corroborating proof behind them. Assertions, just statements made without corroborating evidence, is considered to be inadmissible and doesn't even come into the consideration. And so a lot of the religious assertions that we're talking about are things that really fit that category that just ought to be ruled out from even analysis, from even the deliberative process, without more evidence behind it.
There's another point I wanted to bring up real quick about when we were talking about how somebody who's very religious could automatically fall back to omnipotence, and they'll have any excuse that will go back to faith that will kind of defeat any argument that they come across. And it reminded me a lot of the answer to the already Christian fabricated problem of free will that's misinterpreted or misattributed to Epicurus, the one of free will, which I believe was written by Lactantius, Constantine's advisor. I'm sure you're familiar with it because we see it all the time.
The riddle?
Yeah, yes, the riddle, the trilemma, the problem of evil, whatever you want to call it, which is, like I had just said, something that was made up by Christians. The supposed refutations to it always go back to this sense of omnipotence. Oh, he gave you free will to test you. Well, that's kind of a self-contradictory statement right there, but we could get into that forever. So I suppose we should wrap up.
Okay. Well, then I guess let's adjourn. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks and bye.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.